You don't wake up. You resurface out of something damp, scratchy, and vaguely alive. Straw? Maybe. Mold? Definitely. Your blanket is a burlap sack that smells like goat, and your pillow is the goat. It's still dark, but someone's already coughing. Not a gentle, polite cough. A medieval, lung-rattling, soul-leaving-the-body cough. Welcome to the bottom floor of feudal society. You're a peasant. And it's Tuesday. Your home is technically a house, in the same way a bucket is technically a chair if you sit on it long enough. The walls are wattle and daub, basically a polite term for sticks glued together with mud and animal excretions. There's a hole in the roof that lets the smoke out and the rain in. Birds nest in the rafters. Mice live in the thatch. You just try not to die. You share this one-room wonder with your family. And by family, we mean 12 humans, 4 chickens, 2 pigs, a cow named Judith, and an ongoing lice colony that outnumbers you all. Privacy? That's for nobles. You sleep, snore, scratch, and digest in public view. Your sex life has the discretion of a farm accident. The floor is dirt, not metaphorically. Dirt. You sweep it daily, not to clean it, but to flatten it. There's no toilet, just a bucket. And may God have mercy on whoever has to empty it. Your morning begins with a prayer, not for peace or enlightenment, for survival. You pray that your Lord doesn't double the grain tax again, that the ox doesn't die this week, that your child doesn't catch the cough that already took 3 others this season. Then you eat, or more accurately, you chew, on bread. Not soft baguette-style fantasy bread. This bread could deflect arrows. It's made from rye, barley, and crumbs of despair. If you're lucky, there's onion. If you're really lucky, the onion isn't fermented. Your teeth hurt, your joints ache, and your soul itches. But you get up. Because not working means not eating, and not eating means, well, eventually, peace. Eternal and slightly overdue, you head to the fields carrying tools older than your grandfather, who, by the way, died at 34 of being alive too long. The fields are a muddy poem of repetition. Plow, sow, weep, repeat. The Lord takes most of what grows. You're allowed to keep just enough to stay useful, like a candle never fully lit, never fully out, burnt at both ends, but replaceable. Your wife is spinning wool inside the house, or maybe she's digging roots, or tending the fire, or giving birth, or all of the above. Because multitasking didn't start with smartphones, it started with not dying before Thursday. Children? They're barefoot statisticians of misery. By age 5, they know 3 things: how to trap rats, how to lie to the tithe collector, and how to make soup out of weeds and audacity. And yet, despite the mud, the moaning, the monk-brewed diseases, there's laughter. Not often, not loud, but real. A joke about the priest's bald spot, a fart at the wrong time, a chicken that refuses to die. Resistance comes in many forms. Sometimes it sounds like a giggle during morning mass. The Lord lives uphill, always uphill. His manor is made of stone, with windows and beds that don't share space with livestock. You're not allowed inside unless he needs something. Firewood, a daughter, a confession. He owns your land, your tools, and technically your body, but he doesn't know your tricks. He doesn't see the extra potatoes hidden under the compost, or the real weight of the grain sack padded with clever lies. He doesn't know the herbal tea you drink to avoid his priest's unwanted baptisms, or the coded songs you sing about freedom hidden in harvest hymns. You've learned to live around him, beneath him, like moss on the manor walls, silent, resilient, slightly damp, but alive. And in that mud, in that stench, in that daily dance with despair, you've carved out something astonishing: cleverness. Not the kind that builds cathedrals or writes scrolls. The kind that hides a sick cow during inspections. That, accidentally, burns the Lord's robe on laundry day. That fakes a limp on feast days to skip unpaid labor. You don't have swords or titles, but you have secrets. And in a world where silence is safer than truth, that's power. Your rebellion is not a banner in the wind. It's a missing egg, a smirk, a spoonful less salt. It's subtle, petty, beautiful. The nobility writes history, but you edit it in the margins, one stolen chicken at a time. Now go. The sun is rising. The coffer has stopped. Probably not a good sign. Your day awaits. And somewhere between the mud, the misery, and the manure, you'll find a way to survive. Maybe even smile. But shh, don't let the Lord hear you. Let's talk about dirt. Not metaphorically, actual, honest dirt, the kind that clings to your ankles, your soul, and your dinner. In the Middle Ages, dirt wasn't just something under your feet. It was your landlord, your accountant, and your executioner. And believe it or not, it was also your best accomplice. You see, the nobility had a charming obsession with land. Land was wealth, power, prestige. The more acres a lord claimed, the more taxes he collected, the fatter his turkey legs, and the shinier his wife's headdress. Naturally, this meant measuring land became a sacred ritual, complete with officials, ropes, and lies thick as porridge. Enter you, the dirt-covered peasant who knows more about mud than any taxman in velvet shoes. Here's how the con began. You start with the ridge and furrow trick. Fields were plowed in long raised strips to keep the soil aerated. But those ridges? You could curve them slightly, just enough to lose a few feet at the ends. A little lean here, a gentle slope there. To the naked eye, it was just an old, tired field. But to a trained peasant, it was a game of inches, and inches meant food. Then there was the holy ditch maneuver. A well-placed ditch around a small section of land, decorated with a wooden cross or a broken statue of Saint Blasius, and suddenly, voila, it became church land. Church land was sacred, and most importantly, tax-exempt. Lords knew better than to mess with God's corner. And you? You just prayed the statue didn't fall over during inspections. Still, the real masterpiece of deception was the dirt blend strategy. Imagine this. The steward arrives with a scroll, ready to verify if your patch of land is arable, which means usable for crops, and therefore taxable. So, before he comes, you make it look unusable. How? You dig up stones from the riverbank and scatter them like peasant confetti. You bury fish guts, rotting onions, even human waste, anything to give your soil the bouquet of uselessness. You trample it, soak it, starve it of light with hand-placed brush. By the time the steward inspects it, it looks like the ground itself has given up on ambition. He shrugs, declares it unsuitable. You nod solemnly, hiding your smirk. 2 weeks later, you're planting onions there. Again, with better yield than ever. Of course, none of this was officially taught. There were no peasant seminars in tax evasion. It was passed like sourdough starter, quietly, carefully, and only to those who wouldn't snitch. Children learned by watching their parents miscount the rows. Neighbors coordinated ditches to match. The deception wasn't individual, it was symphonic. And oh, the innovation. Some villagers would time their work to mimic crop failure. On the day the steward was expected, nobody worked the field. No rakes, no hoes, no humming harvest songs. Just a patch of dry nothingness, and a woman loudly wailing about how the worms had cursed their barley again. Theatrics? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Others would fake new boundaries with old fences, pulling them inward during inspection season, then pushing them back when no one was watching. In a world without GPS, tape measures, or decent eyesight past 35, it worked more often than not. The nobility suspected something, of course, but suspicion doesn't pay tithes. Declarations do. And peasants knew how to cry, how to plead, and how to faint convincingly, right as the steward was reaching for his pen. But let's not romanticize it too much. If caught, the consequences were brutal. Extra taxes, public beatings, sometimes worse. One woman was reportedly stripped, tied to her own plow, and dragged through her false furrows as punishment. Another man had his hand nailed to the village stocks with a parchment listing every lie he told until the parchment tore. Still, the risk didn't stop them, because behind every lie was a truth. The truth that the system was never fair. The Lord's taxes didn't feed the hungry. They gilded chalices and sharpened swords. And so, every forged ditch, every moved fence, every accidentally barren patch was justice. Dirty, improvised, and sometimes literally fertilized justice. Even priests looked the other way. They knew. Some even advised on how to arrange the relics. Religion and rebellion have always had a complicated romance. By the end of a year, a clever village might hide up to 15% of its taxable land, enough to save children from hunger, to afford a second tunic, to bury the dead properly. In silence, peasants carved out dignity from the margins, with dirt under their nails and wit behind their eyes. Because when power counts every furrow, intelligence lives in the curve. First, imagine heat, not cozy warmth. Heat, the kind that singes your eyebrows when you open the wrong oven door. The kitchen of a medieval manor was a furnace of flame, sweat, and panic. Dozens of pots bubbling like cauldrons of regret. Knives that hadn't been sharpened since the last crusade. Spilled pig grease turning the floor into a skating rink for the damned. And in the middle of this battlefield, you're not just a cook. You're a peasant with a spoon and a grudge. One bad word from the steward, and your cousin's field gets double taxed. One missed curtsy, and your sister's wedding gets delayed, indefinitely. So you stir, and you watch, and sometimes, very quietly, you act. Let's begin with the salt switch. Salt was expensive. It preserved meat, enhanced flavor, and, crucially, symbolized status. A lord's table had it. Your table? If you were lucky, maybe a memory of it. So when the manor's chef demanded a generous pinch, you delivered, of sugar, or flour, or powdered bone, depending on what you could grind the night before. The result? Venison stew with a haunting sweetness, porridge that tasted like the cemetery. The Lord would spit, fume, and accuse the head cook. But you were just the humble ladle holder. Apologies, my lord. The sack must have been mislabeled. Then came the bread rebellion. In a noble feast, bread wasn't just food, it was decor. Sliced thick, stacked high, used as trenchers, napkins, plates. But bread, like people, can misbehave if handled wrong. You learned how to underbake it just enough so it looked done, but turned to goo halfway through the meal. Or overbake it till it shattered teeth. A crust so hard it could start a rebellion of its own. Best of all, no one suspected. Bread didn't look guilty, it just sat there, innocent, golden, vengeful. And oh, the meat mishaps. The Lord's favorite roast? Slightly overcooked. Not burned, no, just dry enough to irritate, like a joke that doesn't land. The boar's head, decorated with herbs you didn't realize were laxatives. A particularly daring kitchen boy once served mutton stuffed with garlic and garlic's less attractive cousin, wild leeks fermented in vinegar and pig bile. Revenge was often subtle, but not always. Some acts were bold, theatrical, and dangerous. Like the day a maid accidentally spilled boiling broth on a visiting bishop's lap. Or when a scullion smeared chicken fat on the steward's favorite chair before the banquet. He slipped, he screamed, he landed in the Lord's lap. That boy lost his position, but became a legend. Let's pause. This wasn't just kitchen mischief, it was coded rebellion. The kitchen was one of the few places peasants and nobles shared air, if not power. Food passed through calloused hands before reaching velvet mouths. And in that narrow, greasy pipeline, a world of resistance could bloom. Sometimes it was about delayed timing, serving courses late enough to embarrass the host, but early enough to avoid suspicion. Other times, it was about portion control. The steward's cut was mysteriously smaller. The falconer's pie always missing the best bits. A peasant's memory is long. And hungry. There were risks, of course, real ones. One woman was flogged for underspicing a feast that honored a visiting duke. Another had her fingers broken after a lord claimed his eel pie was soulless. Hard to disagree, really. Eel pie isn't known for enlightenment. Some were dismissed, some jailed. A few, especially if accused of poisoning, were executed, without trial, just tossed into the same fire that once roasted their rebellion. And yet, they returned. New cooks came, new maids learned. Whispers were passed with ladles and looks, recipes adjusted in the margins, not in ink, in memory. Because food wasn't just sustenance, it was stagecraft, it was message, it was revenge, served not cold but slightly oversalted, and in the quietest acts, there was poetry. Like the girl who baked a loaf shaped like the Lord's nose, or the boy who whistled a banned peasant song while carving swan, or the cook who for years saved the choicest cuts not for the table, but for the dogs. Because even hounds, in his view, deserved better masters. You might say they were petty, childish. But in a world where your life was taxed, tithed, and taken without consent, a pinch of petty was radical. A crooked crust, a too thick stew, a missing cherry from the tart. These were protests. Not loud, but sharp and edible. So next time someone tells you the poor were powerless, tell them about the bread that bit back, and ask them, how many nobles ate humiliation with their goose that year? It starts with a cough, a gentle one, the kind you might hear in church or on a dusty morning. You clutch your belly, you wince, you mutter, the chill's gotten into my bones again. And just like that, you've called in sick. But here's the twist. It's 1349. There's no union, no paid leave, no HR department to review your symptoms. There's just a field to plow, a pile of thatch to re-roof, and a lord who expects you to work until your lungs give out, or your soul does. So you fake it. You invent fevers, forge stomach aches, perform fainting spells with the dedication of a Shakespearean understudy. Your audience? A steward who smells like mead and suspicion. Your motivation? One more day without backbreaking labor. This is the fake fever strategy, a performance born of desperation, perfected over generations. Part theater, part survival. A peasant's only weapon that required no metal, just timing, a little cough, and enough grit to lie while lying down. It didn't begin as rebellion, it began as necessity. You're malnourished. You haven't slept properly in weeks. Your shoes, if you own any, are more whole than leather. One more day in the sun could break your body for good. So you rest, but only if you perform weakness first. And you have to sell it. Eyes half-lidded, voice raspy, maybe smear a bit of soot under your eyes to simulate shadows. Warm your forehead near the fire before the steward comes sniffing. Lie flat, unmoving, in the center of the floor, like a tragic centerpiece surrounded by unwashed laundry. One cough too few? You're sent to the fields. One cough too many? The priest shows up to administer last rites. It's a delicate art. Over time, entire villages caught on. Not just individuals. Whole communities developed unspoken calendars of collective illness. Harvest too early? Suddenly, half the village is struck by a sweating sickness. Unexpected royal visit? Alas, the plague has returned. Best not risk contact. And so, the manor sees a sudden drop in productivity. Livestock go unmilked, bread unbaked. The smith? His hands tremble with chills. The washerwoman? Too weak to lift the bucket. The children cough on cue. The elderly nod in solemn agreement. To outsiders, it looks like tragedy. But within the walls of the hovel, there's a quiet kind of glee. Because for once, the field lies untouched, and the people lie down. It's not a revolt, not loud, not violent, but it's organized. A form of slow, bodily resistance, a shutdown of production. And the beauty? You can't punish a fever. Of course it wasn't foolproof. Some lords caught on. They brought in their own physicians, quacks in fur collars who poked at your tongue and declared you miraculously healed. Others threatened consequences, extra labor, docked grain rations, or worse. A few simply didn't care and forced the sick back into the fields, where they either recovered or didn't. But illness was slippery. It couldn't be seen or measured, not with medieval eyes. And if too many got sick at once, the manor had no choice but to slow down. Even the cruelest lords feared real disease. Plague was always in the back of their minds. The memory of mass graves and empty manors lingered like the scent of rotting herbs. Peasants knew this. They didn't need books. They had memory, oral history, stories whispered while mending tunics. Remember the Black Death? The steward ran faster than the rats. So when the time came to lie low, you did. Not just for yourself, but for others. The fake fever became communal, a signal, a rhythm, a collective no in a world of constant forced yes. Sometimes, you even used religious cover. The saint warned me in a dream, you'd say. If I labor this week, my crops will rot. Superstition was a shield. And superstition, in a world of relics and rosaries, carried weight. Who was the Lord to argue with a vision? You weren't lazy, far from it. You worked harder than most beasts. But work without choice becomes servitude, and feigned illness. That was your 2-day rebellion. Even priests played along. The soul needs rest as much as the body, one said, quietly, while passing you a slice of bread. Not all fakers were spared. There are records, fragile, faded, of villagers punished for malingering, a man forced to dig ditches as penance, a woman shamed in church, a boy suspected of lying, whipped in front of his mother, but most got away with it. Because deep down, even the steward knew, you couldn't fake this life forever. One day, the real fever would come. And so, you lied today to survive tomorrow. Not for glory, not for justice, for a single morning without weight, for a few hours of stillness, of warmth, of not hurting. And in a world where every breath was taxed, sometimes the most radical act was to pretend you couldn't take one. It starts with silence. No horses, no smoke, no barefoot kids chasing geese. Just wind, maybe a stubborn chicken, and a steward standing confused with a list of names, and no one to yell them at. The village didn't revolt. It didn't burn. It vanished. This wasn't myth or miracle. It was strategy. Survival by subtraction. Because in the Middle Ages, rebellion wasn't always a sword in the throat. Sometimes it was an empty hut and a warm trail in the mud heading east. Running away wasn't easy. You weren't a free citizen with a passport and a weekend bag. You were property. You were Matilda of Lord Becket's turnip patch, not Matilda, aspiring herbalist and free thinker. Leaving the manor meant leaving your name, your plot, your identity. It meant becoming no one. But sometimes, becoming no one was better than being nobody, with blisters and a back tax. So you waited, you watched, you whispered, and one night, without noise or drama, you slipped into the trees. You took what you could carry, a flint, some grain, a half-dry ham, and maybe that old knife Uncle Elias hid in the rafters after the last ox died suspiciously fast. You took your child, your silence, your courage, and you didn't look back. The forests were deep, dark, and full of legends. Perfect. A good peasant knew how to disappear, because the wild was cruel, but the manor was worse. At least the wolves didn't demand tithes or claim your daughter for kitchen service. You weren't the first to vanish. Hidden villages were real. There are traces of them in abandoned clearings, angry church records, and confused royal tax rolls. 9 villagers unaccounted for, suspected plague. The only disease was freedom, and it was spreading, quietly. You built shelters from fallen logs, covered them in moss, camouflaged chimneys with brambles. You taught your kids to play without screaming. You fed them rabbit, stolen barley, and prayers with no saints. You trained the dogs not to bark. You lit fires only on cloudy nights. You became fog. And in that fog, you grew something rare for a peasant. Choice. The new village wasn't pretty. It was damp, cold. It smelled like smoke and fear. But it was yours. No steward came demanding hens. No priest showed up with threats and holy guilt. You could sleep in peace, unless the pigs got into the turnips again. Sometimes whole communities disappeared together, coordinated like a symphony of enough. On Monday, they're bending under sacks of grain. By Thursday, nothing but trampled grass and a half-salted goat. The manor would send search parties. The priest would mutter about devils and pagans. The Lord would fume and sharpen something expensive. But you? You were teaching your son how to fish with thorns. Your daughter was learning to speak without flinching. You were inventing a world where obedience wasn't the only currency. Not all hidden villages survived. Some were discovered when smoke betrayed them in winter. Others were turned in by desperate relatives or cowardly neighbors. One was exposed because someone sang too loudly during a moonlit bath. What came next was always the same: fire, chains, and a sermon. They'd make examples, brand a back, salt a field, nail a skull to a tree. But even then, the memory lingered. Even then, others kept leaving. Because once you tasted freedom, no punishment could make the manor food taste good again. You didn't disappear out of cowardice. You vanished out of clarity. You saw what the system was, a beautiful prison with a chapel, and you chose exile over exploitation. You became the story other peasants told in secret. If you walk past the ash trees and follow the moss till it stops growing, you'll find them, the ones who got out. They weren't saints. They weren't heroes. They were cold, muddy, scratched survivors. But in a world where your birth determined your chains, they were legends, walking proof that the bottom could move without asking. Sometimes the bravest act is not to fight, it's to leave. It doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with silence, with someone stepping out after sunset, carrying a bucket that doesn't slosh the way water does. No one sees, no one asks, and by morning, the manor's well smells wrong. It wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Raw, revolting, undeniably effective. Because when fists couldn't rise and swords were out of reach, the peasants turned to something no lord could ignore: the stink of rebellion. They poisoned the well, not with arsenic or alchemy, but with what every peasant had plenty of: excrement, literal crap, human, animal, fermented in the sun, scooped up with the same hands that milked goats and buried babies, dropped straight into the source of the Lord's drinking water. This wasn't random vandalism. It was targeted, precise, and devastating. The well was sacred. It fed the manor, the kitchen, the noble family's smug little teeth. It cooled their wine, bathed their armpits, kept their stews from boiling into sludge. And then one morning, the water turned cloudy. The smell hit first, then the taste, then the diarrhea. No one suspects the peasants at first. Maybe a dead animal fell in, maybe the wood cover rotted, but the steward notices the chickens seem healthy. The cows are fine. The peasant well, muddy and shared with pigs, smells better than the manor's. Suspicion creeps in, punishments follow, but no one confesses. No one ever confesses. Because this wasn't a single act. It was a message, passed in code, learned in whispers. When the Lord starves your children, poison his tea. When his taxes leave your wife weeping over boiled nettles, give his soup a hint of your disdain. When he uses your daughter like a napkin and calls it hospitality, make him drink from the same cup you piss in. It's revolting. That's the point. This was rebellion for those who couldn't speak aloud, who couldn't read or write, but knew exactly how to make a noble suffer. Quietly, personally, inside his own stomach. Of course there were risks. If caught, it wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was flogging. It was hanging. One man in Brittany was reportedly drowned in the very well he'd corrupted. Another had his hand severed and nailed to the church door with a parchment. Here lies treachery. Still, the protests continued, because nothing screams rebellion quite like screaming from the chamber pot. This wasn't just biological warfare. It was social commentary, served raw, a reminder that even at the lowest rung, the poor could rot the foundations of power, that no castle wall, no tax scroll, no Latin prayer could protect a lord from what lived in the bowels of his people. And it wasn't always literal. Some villages developed what chroniclers called well rituals, a code for coordinated illness, a pact to sabotage without weapons. One would curse the well out loud during market day. Another would claim to see demons in the reflection. The message spread: don't trust the manor's water, fear it, avoid it, let the nobility drink their own fear. And while they boiled herbs and consulted apothecaries, peasants watched and smiled. Not all acts were so blunt. Some peasants took subtler routes, slipping animal entrails into stew pots, throwing spoiled milk into fountains, or dragging rotting carcasses near wine cellars to curse the air. But few things had the visceral punch of feces in the family well. It was base, it was bold, and it worked. Because in a world where nobles saw peasants as tools, half animal, half fungus, this was a reminder: those tools had hands. And those hands could carry more than grain. There's no monument to these rebels. No plaque that reads, "Here, someone took a dump that changed history." But maybe there should be, because revolutions aren't always fought with flags. Sometimes they're fought with buckets. And sometimes the most honest protest is disgusting. He drools a little. His tunic is too short. His laugh bursts at the wrong moments. Too loud, too sharp, like a goose surprised mid-defecation. They call him a fool, an idiot, a simpleton. He pretends not to mind. But beneath the dirt-caked grin and the erratic eye twitches, something else pulses. A rhythm, a plan. Because in medieval society, being underestimated was the safest disguise of all. The fool was everywhere and nowhere. He wandered, he listened, he sat in corners, pretending to chase flies while memorizing which lord had gout and which servant was stealing salted pork. He was given bread out of pity, ale out of amusement, and full access to rooms where others would be beaten for stepping foot. And he remembered everything. Let's get one thing straight. Not all fools were faking. Some truly were touched by illness, trauma, or the brutal randomness of medieval life. But among them lived the actors, the watchers, the ones who saw how power moved and decided, instead of fighting it, to tiptoe around it in floppy shoes. The fool could insult the lord and live. He could mock his mistress's wig or imitate his bishop's lisp during a feast, and be rewarded with scraps and applause. What was comedy to the noble was intelligence in disguise. And that's where the sabotage began. He carried messages in rhymes, warnings in riddles, and gossip under the cover of nonsense. The cow walks backwards, sire, and the pig sings at dusk. Nonsense? Maybe. But the steward now knows to check the grain cellar, and the baker knows to hide the stolen flour behind the holy relics. He helped plan disappearances. He led tax collectors into loops. He once convinced a visiting knight that the village was under a lunar curse, just long enough to stall an inspection. He was invisible, and he knew it. Some say fools were the first couriers of peasant uprisings, not with maps, but with stories. A tale here, a song there, the kind of story that slips under a door and grows teeth. One famous example: a fool named Hob in eastern England who wandered between villages telling a ridiculous story about a talking cow who predicted tax rates. Every village laughed, every steward frowned, every rebellion he visited just so happened to explode a week later. Coincidence? Let's talk logistics. The fool had access. No one searched him. No one feared him. He could walk between barns, kitchens, and chapels. He could spread code without being caught, because no one arrests a man who's licking a dead frog and singing about cabbage. He was also expendable. If caught, who cares? He's mad. Not a threat. Lock him up. He'll eat straw and whisper to ghosts. But here's the trick. By the time the fool was punished, the message was already delivered. And sometimes, when the village burned, the fool walked away untouched. Because even the cruelest knight didn't want to be remembered as the man who beat a half-wit to death. It wasn't chivalrous. It looked bad. So he survived, again and again, grinning, limping, humming tunes that no one realized were warnings. There are darker stories, too, of fools caught helping escapees. of saboteurs found with bells in their pockets. One was drowned for singing a blasphemous ballad, a song that turned out to contain a list of stored weapons hidden in its rhythm. But many more got away, because to pretend to be harmless is, sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do. And in the end, maybe the biggest joke was this. While the lords toasted their power and the knights sharpened their swords, the fool danced behind them, with pockets full of secrets and a tongue that tasted of treason. So next time you picture a medieval idiot with jingling shoes and crossed eyes, ask yourself, what did he see while everyone else was laughing? You kneel, you bow your head, you mumble Latin you don't understand. Around you, incense dances with dust, and a wooden statue of Saint Erasmus stares blankly into eternity. But while your hands are folded in prayer, your mind is doing math. Because this isn't just devotion, it's logistics, it's resistance. It's how to skip labor on St. Mildred's Day without looking lazy. How to reroute a tithe into a pilgrimage. How to weaponize the word of God in a world where your own words don't matter. Religion, for peasants, was never just faith. It was one of the only legal excuses to say no to power. If you knew how to twist the scripture just right. Start with saints. There were hundreds. And every village had a local favorite. Saint Cuthbert the Mild, Saint Agnes the Damp, Saint Thaddeus of Persistent Rashes. Each had a day, some had two. A few had entire festivals. And on those days, no plowing, no taxes, no beatings, in theory. Lords hated it, peasants loved it. A well-timed saint could give you 3 days off, plus leftovers. Now imagine this. The steward arrives demanding extra labor because the Lord's cousin is visiting. You, with solemn reverence, remind him that tomorrow is St. Wulfstan's Day, patron of overworked ditch diggers. To ignore that would be, well, risky, maybe even heretical. Does the steward want to explain to the bishop why his oxen collapsed on a holy day? No. He leaves, you smile, and get back to your beer. But that's just the beginning. Peasants began inventing saints, quietly, locally. A shepherd claimed to see visions of a barefoot man glowing behind the woodshed. Another swore a lump of cheese had healed her boils. It didn't need to be credible. It just needed to travel fast enough to become belief. And with belief came boundaries. This land belongs to Saint Fermentius. This stream is sacred to the Virgin. This field? Holy since the pig saw the angel. You couldn't tax what was divine. You couldn't force work on ground that glowed in stories. You couldn't whip a man for kneeling, even if he was kneeling in front of a conveniently planted bone. It got out of hand. One lord in Saxony reportedly banned 36 saints from his estate after realizing his tenants were praying more than planting. They retaliated by claiming the manor was cursed by Saint Drogo, patron of those who hate landlords. Even the church was split. Some priests supported the peasants, citing scripture, visions, dreams. Others aligned with the lords, offering blessings in exchange for coin. But there was always a loophole, always a relic, always a finger bone of some obscure martyr ready to grant you a day off and a bowl of slightly better porridge. Pilgrimage was another trick. A peasant could vanish for weeks under the holy excuse of walking to a faraway shrine. In reality, visiting cousins, trading goods, sometimes disappearing entirely. One woman claimed she was heading to Canterbury. She reappeared 3 years later with 2 sheep, a new husband, and no explanation. The Lord couldn't protest. She had a signed paper from a monk and a blister on her heel the size of a walnut. Case closed. Relics were even better. A splinter of the true cross. A vial of cloudy water from the Holy Land. A tooth so old and holy it could be pig or prophet. Didn't matter. These objects became untouchable. And when sewn into clothing, buried near fields, or placed above doorways, they created force fields against taxes and inspections. Not literally, but close enough. And there were miracles, real or staged. A child falls sick. His mother refuses to let the priest visit. She claims an angel appeared. The child recovers, probably from not eating spoiled cabbage. A miracle is declared. The house becomes sacred. The tax man turns around. Of course, this wasn't without risk. Some peasants were accused of heresy, of false visions, of faking holiness to dodge work. One man was locked in stocks for worshipping a turnip. Another was whipped after Saint Benedict the cowmender turned out to be his cousin in disguise. But more often than not, it worked. Because belief once planted, spreads. And when truth and superstition share a bed, power trembles. So yes, peasants prayed, they feared, they hoped, but they also schemed. In chapels, in fields, in the shadows of cathedrals, they helped build, but could never enter. They learned that in a world where law and sword belong to the noble, loopholes belong to the faithful. And faith, if used well, could be sharper than any blade. It's easy to romanticize the clever peasant, the trickster with dirt on his face and fire in his brain, the kitchen boy who swaps the Lord's pepper for crushed bugs, the old woman who fakes fevers so her village can rest. They make us smile, they make us cheer, but sometimes they scream, because outsmarting power has a price, and in a world where cruelty wore silk, cleverness was often repaid in flesh. The punishments weren't creative. They didn't need to be. Pain doesn't require imagination. Stocks, floggings, branding, mutilation, public shaming, or just disappearance. One day you're in the field. The next, your children are told you left. Everyone knows what that means. One young man in Normandy was caught red-handed, literally, with red berries he'd used to dye the Lord's ceremonial robe a shade of insult. They found the hidden cloth, found the laughter in the kitchens, and then they found him. His hands were cut off, not as punishment, as warning. Another case. A woman in a small German village had coordinated 3 faked miracles in 2 years, each one granting her people rest from labor. When the steward finally unraveled the trick, she was tied to the church door for 3 days. No food, no water. They say even the priest refused to meet her eyes. But the real cruelty wasn't always in the punishment. It was in the betrayal. Because to be clever in the shadows is to trust that the shadows will protect you. And sometimes they don't. Neighbors turned informants. Family members cracked under pressure. Some confessed to save others. Some confessed out of hunger. One man gave up a list of fellow saboteurs after his daughter was promised bread and boots. She never got them. Genius couldn't always hide. Not from pain, not from winter, not from the slow rot of fear that crept in once the Lord started suspecting everything. And yet, they kept resisting, because even after the whippings, the hangings, the sermons, the wells refilled, and the saints were banned, someone still salted the Lord's bathwater. Someone still sang forbidden songs. Someone still disappeared into the woods. The brilliance of the powerless wasn't in winning. It was in persisting, in planting jokes like seeds, in slipping shame into soup, in making sure the nobleman never sat fully at ease again. And maybe they didn't live long enough to see change, but something shifted. Slowly, the rules began to crack. Laws were rewritten. Lords became landlords. Priests grew cautious. Tax collectors hired guards. Because the laughter of peasants wasn't just noise, it was prophecy. Some stories have no final battle, no decisive victory, just the stubborn, beautiful repetition of rebellion. Day after day, life after life. They died early, they died poor, but not empty. Their cleverness left a mark, not in books, but in the nervous habits of power. And you get to sleep tonight with a full stomach, clean water, and teeth in your mouth. Thanks in part to the ones who didn't. The ones who lied, stole, vanished, prayed too loudly, and sometimes smiled while doing it, even when it cost them everything. So next time you scroll your phone under a duvet, complaining that the Wi-Fi is slow, remember this. Once, survival was an art form, and the artists wore lice instead of laurels. They had no swords, no ink, no voice in council, but they had dirt. They had timing. They had a kind of genius born not from books, but from backs bent under centuries of theft. They didn't overthrow the system, they outlived it. One missing egg, one false fever, one sacred pig at a time. You live in a world built by their sabotage, polished, sanitized, alphabetized. You flush a toilet they never dreamed of. You bite into bread that won't break your teeth. You say no without being whipped. That's not luck. That's inheritance. From peasants who rebelled with buckets, with saints, with spoons. So maybe tonight, before you sleep, whisper a thank you to the ones who disappeared, to the ones who lied, to the ones who laughed, even while they bled. Because somewhere in that mud, someone outsmarted a lord and got away with it.